Hello, I'm Mitchell,
I'm Ashley, and this is Elena.
and this is our Song of Ascent. So it's Christmas, 2021. I hadn't been feeling well all week long, but I had taken an at-home COVID test. I had tested negative for COVID, but still had flu-like symptoms, but I hadn't lost my smell or my taste. I'd been working long hours that week, preparing for year-end stuff at work, a baby that was soon on the way, and a dozen other projects that were on my plate. Christmas Day, I woke up not feeling so well again. What's all this about? So I took another COVID test, and I tested negative and positive. What's that supposed to mean? So, as a precaution, Ashley and I stayed home and isolated and didn't go to any family activities that day. By Monday, I was feeling even worse. I drove myself to a small local hospital to get tested, again, where they confirmed I had COVID pneumonia. I felt absolutely terrible, but they sent me home saying I was young and I would survive. The next day, my oxygen levels continued to drop. I knew I needed serious help. I ate breakfast, packed my bags for a 4-day hospital trip, and headed off to Hershey Medical Center. When I walked out the door that day, I had no idea that it was almost the last time I would ever say goodbye to my wife. I staggered into the emergency room on December 28th, and I was quickly admitted for evaluation. And that's where my story begins to fade. I was put on oxygen, and then quickly moved to high-flow oxygen. I remember that was not fun. I remember it was like hanging out the window of a car, going 100 miles per hour, and trying to breathe. I was in misery. I remember the doctor saying that I would probably need to be put on a ventilator. And I knew that if I was put on a ventilator, that would probably be the end. I wasn't afraid to die, because I knew that I would be going to heaven. There's an incredible peace when you know that your eternity is secured in Jesus Christ.
On December 29th, I got a phone call from one of the ICU doctors. They had said that Mitchell's oxygen levels continued to decline, even on BiPAP. They told me that they had wanted to do an elective intubation because outcomes tend to be worse if they needed to do it emergently. I had asked what the survival rate looked like, and they had said 50 to 70%, but they had said that since Mitchell is young and healthy, they thought that outcomes would be better. I'd wanted to see Mitchell before the intubation, but was told that I wasn't able to because I was pregnant. I had asked Mitchell's brother Colin to go to the hospital and see him, so that way we could all talk about the intubation before it happened. Colin rushed to the hospital and had seen Mitchell. He was very sedated already due to drugs, but we were all able to do a video chat before the intubation to pray and say goodbye. We did do the intubation, and I got a call later in the evening saying that it was successful and that Mitchell was resting comfortably. The doctors had told me that they expected Mitchell to be on the ventilator 1 to 2 weeks. I prayed to God that night, saying, please just let it be 1 week. I don't think I could handle anymore. The next day, I had gotten a phone call again from the doctors saying that Mitchell's oxygen levels had declined severely overnight, and that if we had not done the intubation, it would have had to have been done emergently. The next few days were really hard. I waited for a phone call every day from Mitchell's doctors with updates. He still continued to battle fevers even though he was on antibiotics. They continued to try and put him on his belly to try and increase his oxygenation levels, but were having issues with sedation and trying to keep him comfortable during that time. He got daily x-rays, which showed no changes, and they continued to increase vent settings. One of the doctors had called me saying that they had consulted the ECMO team. They said that this was essentially a lung bypass life support, and that Mitchell had been a candidate for it. They had very strict criteria, but they were not planning on doing this at the time. They said that this was their last resort if everything else they were doing failed. On January 3rd, I had gotten another call from the ICU doctors. They had told me that Mitchell's oxygen levels continued to worsen even on the ventilator. He'd been on it for about a week. They had said that they are ready to start ECMO for him. I needed to consent to this procedure, and they had said that they wanted to know within an hour. They had basically said that they thought that being on the ventilator wasn't going to improve Mitchell's condition, and they said that they wanted to oxygenate the blood outside of Mitchell's body and basically giving his lungs a chance to rest. When I had made the decision to start ECMO for Mitchell, I was about 3 weeks away from my induction date and had asked again about survival rate for Mitchell. They had told me that it was about 50% survival, and they expected him to potentially be on ECMO 1 to 2 months. I could barely sleep during this time and was only eating for the baby. Getting out of bed each day was difficult, and I could barely get anything done besides worry and wait for doctors to call and give me updates on Mitchell's condition. Friends and family would call me or text me throughout the day, sending me Bible verses or wanting to pray with me. Turning to my faith was one of the only things that would soothe me during this time. In the evenings, I would kneel by Mitchell's side of our bed and pray for him, pray for healing and recovery, and that he would return to our family. During that time, I was crying most of the prayers and just knew that God was still listening to me and that he was with me. Each time I would feel the baby kick, which seemed to be a lot in the evenings, I would know that God had given us a precious gift and that I was never alone. During the next 2 weeks, there was a lot of ups and downs as far as Mitchell's health. I couldn't visit him during that time, but was able to ask nurses in the evening to hold a phone up to his ear so I could talk to him and pray for him. He was sedated, but at times he was able to squeeze their hand when I had talked to him, and at one point one of the nurses had said that he was trying to blow me kisses even with a tube down his throat. 17 days after intubation, I had gone in to see Mitchell. There was an ICU doctor that had seen me and my 9-month pregnant belly, and he looked at me and said, "When are you having this baby?" I had told him in less than 2 weeks. He said, "My goal is to get your husband off the vent today." Mitchell was successfully extubated and the ECMO machine was doing all the work. As Mitchell was waking up, he was so confused, and his brain, you could tell, just was so foggy, and his mind was going every which direction. It was a really rough night. He could barely talk because the tube had been down his throat for so long, and we tried to communicate, and I kept telling him that I was okay and that the baby was okay and that God was with us and is going to get us through this whole thing.
As I began to wake up after 17 days of sedation and being unconscious, I began to realize how much time had passed. The next several weeks of recovery in the ICU was a battle like no other, mentally and physically. Doctors said I might be here for months if I was ever able to get off the ECMO life support. It was a struggle, and one that I had to learn to surrender to God. So ECMO, in non-medical terms, is like 1/4-inch diameter hydraulic hoses that were stuck into my neck. And what that did was circulate the blood outside of my body and oxygenate it to allow my lungs a chance to heal. Every day, specialists would come in and check the pump of the machine that was literally keeping me alive. They needed to make sure that the filters weren't clogging, that the blood wasn't clotting, and that all the settings were correct, because this was my life support. It was a strange feeling sitting there, and I could see the machine that was literally keeping me alive, humming right along right beside me. During this whole time, I had a feeding tube inserted through my nose. I also had a head cold during this time, so through the congestion in the feeding tube, I could barely breathe. Every single day, they would turn down my ECMO settings a little bit more. What this meant was that my lungs and my body had to breathe on its own, and more of the work was taken off the life support and put on me. Some days, the ICU specialists would come in and do their rounds, and they would not turn down my ECMO settings. I was on a mission to get out of that hospital and get home to my wife, and when they wouldn't turn down the settings, it crushed my spirits. I pleaded with God daily that He would perform a miracle. I knew that if God wanted, He could heal me in an instant, and I could get up and walk out of that hospital. It was at this time that a song came over the radio that I was listening to in my hospital room. It was the song "Even If" by Mercy Me. The song went something like this: God, I know You're able, and I know You can save through the fire with Your mighty hand. But even if You don't, my hope is in You alone. I broke down sobbing. I had been begging God to move mountains, to perform a miracle. And this song, what if God chose not to move mountains in my life? What then would I say? During this time, I realized that God has a purpose in everything. Throughout all of history, God has used the broken and the bruised to bring glory to His name. I decided if I was there in the hospital, I would praise God no matter what, and I would tell people about Jesus. If the doctors were going to call me the crazy Jesus guy in room 1164, so be it. I talked about Jesus with the janitors, with nurses at 4 a.m. when they changed out the arterial lines in my wrists. I praised God in front of the ICU specialists when they turned down my ECMO settings, and I gave God the glory when the nurses remarked at my rapid recovery. I was progressing and recovering so rapidly that the ICU specialists decided to take the ECMO and remove the hoses from my neck. Breathing was incredibly difficult without the ECMO to support me. Simply sitting up in the hospital bed, I almost passed out. It was taking 17 liters of high-flow oxygen through a mask just for me to be able to stand for a few seconds to try to get into a chair. The next morning, I prayed that God's literal breath would fill my lungs. That same day, my feeding tube was removed and I was placed on an unrestricted diet. I was able to eat real food for the first time in over a month. That same day, I was also able to walk a few steps across the hospital room to a wheelchair without my oxygen levels reaching dangerously low levels. God had performed a miracle, and He was moving mountains.
I cried in the car the night before my induction after saying goodbye to Mitchell. My last month of pregnancy was not how I had thought it would go. Having my husband critically ill, missing some of the holidays, and spending our 4th anniversary in the hospital. It was all sinking in that we were about to have our daughter and that he wasn't going to be able to be with me. I was in a different hospital than Mitchell was, but we were able to set up our phones to be able to do a video chat. Both my mom and his mom were with me for support, and my dad had been with Mitchell. When I was admitted, I had progressed rather quickly and got to about 10 centimeters dilated. I was ready to push. By the time I got to 10 centimeters, the OBGYN came in and said that the baby was in too much distress and they had wanted to do an emergency C-section. At that point, I stopped feeling pain and just cried because that was not my plan. They took me back to the OR and got me prepped for surgery. Mitchell had been on the video chat and was talking to me and ended up praying for me during the time Elena was born. It helped calm me, knowing that he was able to see me and talk to me during that time. The baby ended up being fine. She had the cord around her head, so that was causing all the distress. But everything was fine and she was healthy, and so was I. Mitchell and I were so happy to become parents. When the doctor handed me Elena the first time to hold her, I couldn't wait. Getting this beautiful little girl placed on my chest was the best thing ever. We decided to name her Elena because Elena means shining light. Mitchell and I had prayed every night for her that she would be a shining light for God's glory. A week after Elena was born, I had gotten a phone call from her pediatrician. They had said that they had done some blood work when she was born and it showed an abnormality. They had told me that she could potentially have cystic fibrosis and that she would require more testing. Mitchell and I wondered how our family could go through so many more trials. The unknown was horrible, and I think I cried the entire day, not knowing what was going to happen. We continued to pray over our precious girl for the next month as we waited to get her tested. Eventually we got her test date and we went into the hospital. She was tested in the morning, and then by the afternoon we had met with a pediatric pulmonologist, and they had told us that Elena does not have cystic fibrosis. They said she is a carrier of the disease, but she does not actually have cystic fibrosis, and that there's no complications and she would be a happy, healthy girl. We were so ecstatic for good test results for Elena.
So what's next? Lung specialists say it could take years of healing for my lungs to return to what may not be 100% normal. Currently, my lungs are at 60 to 70% capacity. Every day is a battle, and there will be a long road of recovery ahead. Ashley and I continue to heal both physically and mentally. At the time of filming this testimony, I had a sudden onset of anxiety and depression. Spiritual warfare is real, and I believe the enemy is trying to use this anxiety to take away from us sharing about the miracle that God has performed in our life. God, you've been so faithful and you've been so good. We will cling to you, come what may.
Jesus, I thank you that we can say, "It is well with our soul."